It's strange how you can live a whole life beside someone and not see the moment when their love quietly folds itself away. It doesn't happen in an argument or in one decisive betrayal. It happens in silence, in the long pauses between conversations, in the mechanical kiss before sleep, in the way their eyes stop lighting up when you enter a room. That's how I lost her, not with a bang but with stillness. Her name was Elise. She was brilliant, ambitious, magnetic in that way that made you believe she belonged in boardrooms and glass towers. Not in a two-bedroom apartment with bills unpaid, and an air conditioner that wheezed like it was on its last breath. And yet for a time she chose me. Or at least she chose the idea of me. A man with good intentions who wore his dreams like dusty shoes, visible but too worn to matter. Back then, I worked as a systems engineer at a mid-tier logistics firm. Nothing glamorous, just code, servers, and a quiet paycheck. I wasn't hungry for promotion. I wasn't chasing some dream of grandeur. I just wanted a peaceful life, a garden, a dog, perhaps a child if the stars aligned. Elise, however, wanted more, always more. She started her MBA while we were still together. Late nights, weekend seminars, networking brunches with names I couldn't pronounce. She began dressing sharper, thinking faster, laughing less. I watched her evolve, admired it, but I didn't realize she was outgrowing me in the process. I still remember the morning she looked at me with pity instead of love. That was the moment everything began to crumble. She didn't leave suddenly. It was a series of subtle disappearances. First her voice, then her touch, then the plans we used to make on rainy Sundays. Eventually, she sat across from me one evening with eyes full of rehearsed kindness and said she needed a partner who could match her fire. That I was steady, too steady, a comfort, not a catalyst. I didn't argue, I simply nodded. I loved her enough not to ask her to stay in a place where she felt she couldn't grow. And perhaps part of me knew it was time to let her go before I began resenting the woman she was becoming. She moved out within the week. I helped carry her boxes to the car. She thanked me. I watched her drive away in a silver sedan that glinted like a future I wouldn't be part of. For a while I felt hollow, not angry, just emptied out. Like someone had scooped the warmth from inside my chest and left only the echoes of what used to be. Friends tried to console me with phrases like, "You'll find someone new," or "She wasn't the right one," but none of that helped. Because I wasn't grieving just her. I was grieving who I had been with her, the version of myself that believed love could be enough. The years that followed were quiet. I kept my job, kept my habits, kept to myself, but something inside me had shifted. Not bitterness, I never let myself turn sour, but a slow, burning curiosity. I began reading more about markets, startups, digital finance. What started as a distraction became an obsession. I took online courses in machine learning, blockchain structures, privacy encryption. I spent nights poring over white papers while the rest of the world slept. At first, it was just for me a mental challenge, a private world where I could feel control again. But over time, it began to grow. I built a prototype for a decentralized escrow platform, just an idea. Just a simple, clean interface that allowed peer-to-peer payments without the usual labyrinth of middlemen and transactional hold times. I posted it on a niche forum. Within a week, 2 tech investors contacted me. Within a month, I had the seed capital to start a small team. I named the company quietly, without flourish, something modest, something I never planned to brag about. Growth came slowly, then all at once. Word spread. We were agile, secure, and respectful of privacy in a world that had forgotten what that word meant. I declined interviews, avoided LinkedIn. I didn't want to be known. I wanted the product to speak. Within 5 years, we were handling millions in transactions daily. I stepped down as public founder and appointed a professional face, someone younger, photogenic, good with buzzwords. Behind the scenes, I remained the majority shareholder, but nobody knew. Not even the people I hired. The anonymity suited me. Somewhere in those years, I heard Elise had remarried. Her new husband was a former hedge fund star turned venture capitalist. Together, they had taken control of a large asset management company. The kind that appeared in Forbes and sponsored charity galas with clinking champagne flutes and strategic camera angles. She was the face of it now, CEO, featured in polished profiles with headlines like, "The Queen of Modern Capital," or "How Elias Harper Reinvented the Financial Game." She wore power like a tailored suit. Her photos radiated success. I didn't feel resentment. If anything, I felt distant admiration. She had become who she was always meant to be. And I had become someone else entirely, someone invisible but no less powerful. Our paths had diverged, but they still curved through the same orbit. Because one day, her company became a custodian for a fund, a very large anonymous fund worth over $700 million. Mind, it happened through intermediaries, layers of shell entities and private wealth management firms that protected my name. Their firm only saw the code, the digits, the balance. They treated it like gold, which it was. They never knew the owner. Until one day, I decided to walk in. Not because I wanted recognition, not because I wanted revenge, but because I needed to look it in the eye, the past, the difference between who I had been and who I had become. I needed to see if they could recognize value without a label. If the people who once walked past me like a shadow would know how to treat someone without a title. I wore no suit, no watch, no car with tinted windows. Just myself. I walked into the lobby of her glass fortress one quiet Wednesday morning, and the moment I stepped through those doors, I knew something in me had changed forever. But I didn't expect what came next. And neither did they. After Elias left, I didn't collapse. That surprised some people, including myself. I didn't spiral into self-destruction or bitterness. I didn't change my hair, or move to a new city, or reinvent my social circle. I stayed right where I was, in the same modest apartment, walking the same creaky floors, boiling the same water for the same cup of tea I drank every evening. Some might call it stagnation. I called it anchoring, and I needed that anchor. I needed stillness to hear the inner shift happening inside me. Because although I remained in the same place, something beneath my skin had changed. I began to feel the sting of being underestimated, not by the world, but by someone who once claimed to love me. That sting didn't burn like anger. It settled like cold resolve. I didn't want to prove her wrong. I wanted to prove myself right, that I was capable of more, that I had simply never been asked to reach higher. I didn't know where to begin, so I started with what I knew: systems, patterns, architecture. I had always been fascinated by the mechanics behind smooth digital experiences, not the shine on the surface, but the machinery beneath it. I immersed myself in articles, white papers, subreddits, Discord groups. There was a quiet revolution happening in finance, and I could feel its pulse. Decentralized systems, anonymous transactions, frictionless exchanges. It started with a single line of code. Late one night, unable to sleep, I opened my laptop and began writing. I didn't know what I was building, only that I needed to build something. It began as a simple API that could move funds between users without revealing identities. It was elegant, minimal, no flash, just function. I posted it online, attached to a burner alias, and forgot about it. Until the emails started coming. Not fanfare, not praise, just questions, requests, suggestions. A few anonymous investors reached out, asking if the code could be scaled, if the logic could support more complex workflows. I responded quietly, cautiously. I didn't trust anyone, but I was intrigued. Over the next few months, what began as a side project became a platform. Not just software, but a living network of decentralized financial operations: escrow, smart contracts, silent settlements. It had no brand, no logo. It lived in shadows, built for those who wanted to move quietly. By the end of the first year, I had hired 2 engineers. I paid them in crypto. We never met in person. I kept everything compartmentalized. I'd seen enough ambition destroy companies from within to know how quickly a name or a face could become a liability. Anonymity was not just a philosophy, it was protection. Then came the merger. It wasn't something I planned, but rather something that grew out of necessity. A Singapore-based firm reached out through encrypted channels. They liked what we'd built. They wanted to integrate it into their global transaction infrastructure. The deal was complicated, cloaked in NDAs, rooted through 5 jurisdictions. But when it was done, I found myself holding a substantial equity stake in a vast digital finance empire. That was the first time I saw the number. 9 digits. I didn't feel triumphant, I felt numb. The money didn't change me, not immediately. I didn't buy a penthouse or a sports car. I didn't start wearing designer suits or dating models. Instead, I bought a quiet property on the edge of the city where I could hear the wind move through trees. I renovated it simply. Clean lines, natural light, a place to think, not to entertain. The fortune remained mostly untouched. I distributed it across anonymous holdings, blind trusts, digital wallets. Not for secrecy, but for space. I didn't want to be close to it. I didn't want the weight of wealth to corrode what I had built with quiet hands. So I let it sit, like a secret I was still deciding whether to share. People from my past reached out. Old classmates, former coworkers, some pretended to stumble across me online, others didn't pretend. But I never replied. I wasn't hiding. I was simply uninterested in re-entering the noise. Then one day, I learned that Eliza's company, the very firm she had climbed to the top of, had become one of the custodians managing high-value portfolios for global accounts. They had unknowingly taken on one of mine. It had come through an intermediary I trusted, an old partner in the Singapore deal who had rooted it there without realizing the personal connection. At first, I considered moving the money elsewhere, but then something stopped me. I wanted to see how she'd treat a stranger with power. I wanted to know if success had taught her compassion, or only reinforced the caste system she used to worship from afar. So I let the account stay, watched how they handled it, monthly reports, regular updates, courteous but cold. Everything done by the book. Years passed, I never interfered. Until the day I saw an internal update recommending direct engagement with high-net-worth clients to deepen relationships. They were pushing for face-to-face connections. They wanted to put a handshake to the name, even if the name was false. A gesture, nothing more. That was when I decided to walk in. I didn't plan a speech. I didn't rehearse a reveal. I simply wanted to test a theory, that the true character of people reveals itself not in how they treat the powerful, but in how they treat those they believe are powerless. I dressed as I always did, no watch. No tailored anything, just a man with quiet shoes and calm eyes. When I arrived at the firm's headquarters, a glass cathedral of ambition towering over the financial district, I didn't feel small. I felt grounded, like a tree among metal scaffolding. I asked to speak to someone about a withdrawal. The receptionist gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes and pointed me toward the VIP desk. I waited. A man emerged, sharp suit, hair sculpted like architecture. He glanced at my clothes, then at the name on the tablet. His posture changed. I recognized him. Not from photos, from years ago, Eliza's new husband. Of course, it had to be him. He extended a hand without warmth, asked my business. I explained, briefly, that I wished to discuss a transfer from one of their larger private accounts. He smirked. Then he looked at me like I was wasting his time. As if I were a clerk, not a client. A man beneath the floor he stood on. I didn't flinch, I simply watched. He made a comment, subtle, condescending. A dismissal dressed as professionalism. I watched the contempt unfold in layers. He didn't know who I was, that much was clear. But more than that, he didn't care. He believed, as so many do, that worth can be measured in clothing, posture, polish. He walked away to find someone else to handle me. And that was when she walked in. Eliza. She didn't see me at first. She was on a call, moving quickly, commanding the room with the ease of someone used to being obeyed. Then her eyes landed on me. For a second, she paused. Not recognition, but something softer, a memory brushing her shoulder. Then her husband returned, whispered in her ear, her face hardened. She turned to look at me again, this time with suspicion. Then disbelief. And then, everything changed. The moment her eyes fully met mine, time compressed into a silent wait between us. There was no recognition at first, not in the way you expect a person to remember a face, but in the way a buried part of themselves flickers back to life for a single breath. I watched her jaw tighten, subtly, almost imperceptibly. A line formed across her brow, the kind that appears not with age but with the return of something unresolved. She didn't speak, she didn't need to. Her silence was a language we had once shared intimately. It hung in the air like a filament, vibrating with the truth we both tried to ignore. Her husband said something under his breath to her, but she didn't respond. Not immediately. She looked at me, or through me, and I could almost hear the quiet machinery of calculation begin behind her eyes. The careful parsing of possibility. Was it really him? Why is he here? What does he want? Does he know? I didn't smile. I didn't blink. I simply stood there, hands relaxed at my sides, feeling more in control than I had in years. It was clear she hadn't known the client on the books, the foreign trust with 7 trailing zeros. Belonged to the man she left in a dusty apartment half a lifetime ago. That account had been rooted through so many hands. Sealed under so many names that even she, with all her new power, hadn't pierced the veil. Until now. What struck me wasn't the shock in her expression, but how quickly she composed herself. It wasn't shame that rushed to her surface, it was poise. The mask she had learned to wear so well in this world of glass offices and calculated greetings. I saw the transformation, swift and fluid. The ex-wife giving way to the CEO, the woman who once loved me dissolving into the role of public face, protector of image. She adjusted her posture, gave her husband a look. He didn't understand what was happening, not yet, but he sensed the shift. His smugness faltered, only slightly, but it was enough. A moment later, a young assistant approached, summoned hurriedly, and I was led to a private consultation room. The kind reserved for serious transactions. They didn't want a scene. They didn't want questions. In the span of 2 minutes, I had gone from being an invisible man to a risk. I sat in the chair by the tall windows, staring out at the city that had once seemed so far beyond my reach. Skyscrapers that once symbolized everything I lacked now seemed like hollow trophies. Their shine didn't impress me anymore. The quiet in that room, the click of a pen, the distant murmur of traders on another floor was more honest than any ceremony they could have offered. Then the door opened and she entered. Alone. For a moment she didn't move, just stood there backlit by the glass, a silhouette of the woman I once knew, wrapped in the armor of her success. And I thought to myself, how strange, how impossibly strange. That the girl who once curled into my arms during thunder now stood across from me like a stranger rehearsing diplomacy. She crossed the room, placed a slim leather folder on the table, and slid into the seat across from me. I watched her hands. They didn't tremble, of course they didn't. She had trained herself too well. We sat there in silence, 2 people surrounded by millions but entirely alone. She opened the folder, papers, spreadsheets, disclaimers. The instruments of modern trust management. She laid them out slowly, methodically, as if hoping their neatness might sanitize the chaos of what was now unfolding. I let her talk, not in words but through her performance. She wanted control, authority, clarity. She wanted to move past the awkward moment of recognition and return to the safe ground of professionalism. But the ground wasn't safe, not anymore. Because I could see it, the flicker behind her practiced eyes. She was remembering not just who I was, but who she had been. The nights we spent eating instant noodles, laughing at nothing. The mornings I made coffee and sang badly off-key. The notes I left her on napkins when I left for work early. The night she packed her bags and didn't look back. Did she regret it? I don't know. Maybe she didn't even know. Sometimes regret doesn't arrive as guilt. Sometimes it arrives as unease, as a hairline fracture in your carefully sculpted world. As she continued to gesture across the papers, explaining some policy, some threshold, some compliance rule, I let my eyes drift to her wedding ring. A perfect band, platinum I guessed, not too bold, sophisticated, it caught the light like a shield. And suddenly I remembered the last gift I gave her, a small compass, engraved with her initials. She never carried it. Said it was cute and tucked it into a drawer. Now she didn't need directions. She thought she was already at the top. Eventually, her husband reappeared. I watched his eyes try to decipher what the silence between us meant. He asked a question. I could see it on his lips, and when I didn't answer, he began to assert himself again. A monologue, probably. Something about firm policy or client protocol. His voice rose slightly, trying to re-establish the hierarchy that had cracked only moments before. I simply reached into my coat pocket, took out the envelope, thick sealed, with the transfer request inside, and I placed it on the table without a word. He looked confused, then irritated. Then finally his eyes widened. Because in that moment, as he read the numbers, as he saw the account code, he realized the magnitude of the loss. $700 million. Gone. With a signature. Mind. And his voice, once booming with confidence, stilled. Elise didn't flinch. She didn't plead. She just closed the folder slowly, deliberately, and folded her hands over it. And for a fraction of a second, a single irretrievable moment, her eyes dropped to the table. Not in defeat, but in understanding. She knew it wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about value, and the price of forgetting it. There's a moment in every man's life when he must decide whether to let his silence protect the past or expose the truth. When I walked into that building, I wasn't looking for revenge. I wasn't looking to prove anything. I was there for one reason alone, to remind myself that I hadn't disappeared. For years I had built in the shadows a quiet empire, a machine that fed itself. I had grown from ashes without spectacle, without validation. I had learned the power of restraint, of moving without noise. I no longer needed applause, but I did need one thing: clarity. And that only comes when you're willing to look directly into the eyes of what once broke you. That day, as I stood in the penthouse-level conference room, watching the skyline tremble in the reflection of the glass, I felt nothing close to rage. Only stillness, the kind of stillness you find at the bottom of the ocean, far from the noise of waves, cold, deep, ancient. The papers had been signed. The withdrawal had been finalized. The amount, $700 million, was being rerouted across multiple destinations. Not a single dollar would remain in their portfolio. It was surgical, clean, and irreversible. I hadn't spoken much through the process. I didn't need to. Everything important had already been said, not in words, but in expressions, in silence. In the way, her husband's fingers twitched slightly as he realized what had just happened. He had underestimated me. It wasn't personal, not to him. I was just another man in a plain jacket with old shoes and no visible title. His world, like many, revolved around the illusion of hierarchy, clothing, posture, office size. He had no reason to respect me, because he had already decided I wasn't worth knowing. And in doing so, he had exposed himself more than I ever could. I could see it in his face, the breakdown of narrative. He had likely built a version of his wife's ex in his head, a failure, a forgotten name, a cautionary tale she never mentioned. He had never asked about me, never wondered why she avoided the topic. And now, the embodiment of that blind spot was sitting across from him, calmly dismantling a quarter of his firm's annual liquidity. Elise remained composed, but I could sense the storm behind her stillness. She had always been good at pretending control, but this was different. This wasn't just a client choosing to leave. This was a reckoning. And she knew it. Not because I'd announced it, but because it didn't need to be said. This wasn't vengeance. It was consequence. I stood slowly, the final paperwork still warm from the friction of signatures. The room felt smaller now, the walls tighter. The light more artificial. She looked at me as I turned to leave, not with hostility, not with regret, with recognition. That was the word. Recognition. She saw me, maybe for the first time in years, not as the man she once left, but as the man who had survived her leaving. And in that single glance, I saw the years collapse between us. I remembered the day I'd watched her drive away from our apartment, the box of her books still sitting on the passenger seat. I remembered wondering if I'd ever matter again, to her, to anyone. And now, years later, I had walked into her fortress and taken back every piece of that question. But what surprised me wasn't that I felt vindicated. What surprised me was how empty it felt. Because no amount of money, no withdrawal, no signature could rewrite what had already been lost. The chance for us to have known each other truly, without masks, without ambition weaponized as judgment. As I exited the building, I passed by employees who didn't know what had just occurred. Secretaries, assistants, interns, all going about their lives, unaware that the walls they worked inside had just shifted. No alarms rang. No glass broke, just numbers quietly vanishing into the void. A driver was waiting for me at the curb. I had requested no luxury, just a black car with tinted windows, not to hide but to reflect. As the city moved past my window, I thought about power. Not the kind that buys attention or silences dissent, but the kind that makes people rethink how they see the world. The kind that doesn't demand to be respected, it simply is. In my early years, I had misunderstood power. I thought it came with visibility, with titles, with noise. But now I understood real power is discretion. The ability to act without needing to be seen, to reshape a room without raising your voice. I arrived home to silence, just the wind brushing against the trees outside. My house was still the same, still minimalist. Still serene, still mine. I went into the study and sat at the desk where it had all begun, where I had written the first line of code, where I had first dared to imagine that I might be more than what I was left with. On the desk sat a copy of a letter I had never sent. To her. I had written it the first year after she left, folded it, left it sealed. It wasn't angry, it wasn't desperate. It was honest. It spoke of the pain of being unloved without explanation. Of the shame I carried in being judged not for my actions, but for my inability to fit into someone else's idea of success. It asked no questions. It offered no blame. It simply existed, a record of a man who had loved, lost, and learned. I opened it that night for the first time in years. Read it again. Then burned it. Not out of hate, but because I no longer needed to be heard. I had heard myself, and in doing so, I had healed. They would recover, of course. The company, the firm, they had other clients, other funds, other headlines to chase. In time, this loss would be recorded, sanitized, buried in quarterly reports. But somewhere in the quiet moments between deals, they would remember. They would remember the man who walked in unannounced, who asked for nothing, who smiled only once at the very end, and who reminded them that value isn't always loud. Sometimes it just signs quietly and walks away. The pen was heavier than I remembered. Not literally, just in meaning. It had been years since I signed something that changed everything, not since the divorce papers. But this was different. That signature had ended something. This one completed something. When the form was placed in front of me, a bland document in a leather folio with neutral wording and cold columns, I didn't hesitate. My hand moved with a calmness I hadn't known in my younger life. It was a strange kind of grace, not forgiveness, not revenge, just an arrival. An endpoint, the final period at the end of a sentence that had taken a decade to write. As the tip of the pen scratched across the paper, I didn't think of the money. I thought of every version of myself who had doubted this moment would ever come. The man who stood in line at grocery stores, calculating if he could afford both eggs and coffee. The man who walked home in the rain because his gas card maxed out. The man who watched his wife walk out the door without turning back. And then I thought of her, sitting across from me, composed, contained, still trying to decipher whether this was personal. It wasn't, not in the way she feared. I hadn't come to destroy her. I had come to free myself from the memory, from the weight, from the lingering question. Was I ever enough? Signing that form didn't answer the question. It dissolved it. I pushed the folder forward across the table and leaned back. The silence in the room became charged. Her husband stood behind her, posture stiff, hands folded. The assistant who had been called in to witness the paperwork remained professionally blank. But I saw it, the flicker of confusion behind the mask. These people had seen deals bigger than countries, yet none of it prepared them for a moment when power entered the room wearing no badge, no brand, no noise. I didn't offer any closing statement. There was nothing left to say. Words would have cheapened the clarity. I had spent years rebuilding my life in silence. It only felt right to complete the arc without a final speech. As I left the room, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the mirrored glass. I didn't look like the ghost I had feared becoming. I looked grounded, real. Not polished like their world demanded, but something more enduring, weathered, yes, but whole. Downstairs, the lobby hummed with movement. Phones rang, laptops clicked, people walked past me without a second glance. I was invisible to them the way real wealth often is, the way quiet power prefers to be. That anonymity had once made me feel small. Now it gave me peace. The driver was waiting again. Same car, same silence. As the doors closed and we pulled away from the curb, I looked back once, not at the building, but at the story I was leaving behind inside it. I didn't hate them, not anymore. Hate is just another kind of tether. What I felt was weightless. I thought back to our last year of marriage. The small moments, breakfast tables, unpaid bills, laughter that tried too hard. I had believed love could bridge the gap between what she needed and what I was. But love, when unshared, turns into something else. Burden, resentment, pity, and pity was always the worst of the three. What she never understood, and what her new husband surely didn't either, was that I never lacked ambition. I lacked conformity. I never wanted the ladder they worshipped. I wanted to build a different structure entirely. One with no floors, one that could stretch outward instead of upward, not for applause but for freedom. When I got home, I didn't celebrate. I sat in the garden. The trees were still. The air smelled of citrus and soil. A cat from the neighbor's yard wandered through the fence slats and sat beside me like it had always belonged there. I reached down, let it curl near my foot. No pretense, no fear. That was how life should be. The news broke a week later. Not publicly, quietly, through the right channels. A large private fund had pulled from their firm, no reason given. It made headlines in trade publications. The sort that only those in the know really read. Speculation followed. Was it a protest? A hostile play? A precursor to acquisition? None of it mattered. The numbers spoke louder than the theories. Their stock dipped, not drastically, but enough. Enough for board members to call emergency meetings. Enough for journalists to start connecting dots. I kept my name out of it, as always. But they knew. She knew. I received no calls, no emails, not even a letter. I respected that. Sometimes silence is the sincerest apology. I took the funds and split them 3 ways. The first went to the nonprofit. I had started anonymously, one that provided microloans and financial literacy programs to communities abandoned by traditional systems. It had always been my private act of rebellion against the arrogance of finance. The second went into the hands of a team I had mentored quietly, young developers, disillusioned by the industry, still idealistic enough to build with ethics. I gave them capital, not control, told them only one thing in my final message: never build for ego. And the third portion, I let it sit, untouched, a reminder that I didn't need it, a seed for something I hadn't yet imagined. Money isn't power. Discretion is. Peace is. Clarity is. In the weeks that followed, I watched interviews of her smile slightly tighter, her answers more guarded. The sparkle had dimmed, not gone, but tempered. She had tasted humility, and though she would never admit it. I think it added something to her, a weight perhaps, but also a kind of depth. Maybe that's what life does. It wears us down until the surfaces fade, and the substance is all that's left. She would recover, they both would. Their empire might be bruised, but it would continue. That was fine. I had never wanted to end anything. I had only wanted to finish something. There's a difference. Ending is destruction. Finishing is release. And I had released myself. The man I was when she left, the man she called comfortable, limited, safe, that man was gone, not erased, but evolved. I carried him with me now, not as shame, but as origin. He had loved purely. He had failed kindly. And he had survived fully. Sometimes I walk by that building again. Not out of spite, just curiosity. I watch the people entering, the suits, the heels, the ambition walking upright like it owns the air. I wonder how many of them think they're winning. How many think they're untouchable? I wonder who among them knows the difference between money and meaning. Then I keep walking, because I no longer need to look back. In the days that followed, I found myself waking up earlier, not out of anxiety or routine, but instinct. A soft inner pull that no longer needed alarms. The sun would barely crest over the ridge, and I'd be in the kitchen already, barefoot. Boiling water, watching steam curl into the morning light. There was something sacred in that quiet. Something that had escaped me in my younger years, when my thoughts moved too fast and my heart was still trying to prove its worth. Now there was no proving left to do. The headlines faded, as I knew they would. The industry has a short memory when it comes to disruption without scandal. They called it an anonymous client pivoting their portfolio strategy. That was the phrase they used, safe. Vague, untraceable, just how I wanted it. They never knew it had been personal. But even that word, personal, didn't hold the same weight for me anymore. It wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about value. Understanding it, reclaiming it, redefining it, not just for myself, but for those who'd been told they had none. When I was younger, I believed value came from outcomes, from raises, praise, promotions, tangible things, external things. I thought the world would hand me worth if I behaved well enough, worked hard enough, loved deeply enough. But the truth is more brutal and more liberating. The world only mirrors back the value you see in yourself. And if you don't see any, neither will they. That's what Elise never understood. That's what her husband, with his pressed suit and inherited confidence, never had to learn. And that's what I spent years discovering, slowly, painfully, honestly. There was no celebration after it ended, no drink raised, no one to congratulate me. And I liked it that way. Because victory isn't always noisy. Sometimes it's the soft sound of a door closing, not in someone's face, but behind you, finally, forever. I spent the next weeks doing things I hadn't done in years. I painted my study, not because it needed it, but because I wanted to. I visited a bookstore that had once given me shelter when I was broke and broken. I left a donation in their tip jar that would cover their rent for a year. Anonymously, of course, it wasn't about the gratitude. It was about honoring the places that held me when no one else did. I reconnected with the version of myself that once felt forgotten. Not the successful one, not the powerful one. But the version that dared to keep going anyway. That man had nothing, not even his dignity some nights, but he kept moving forward. He kept showing up. He didn't know who he'd become, but he trusted the silence enough to listen. One afternoon, I stood in front of a mirror and looked at myself the way I hadn't in years. Not critically, not with scrutiny. Just honestly. And I saw someone I didn't recognize, not because he was unrecognizable, but because he was whole. The scars were still there, but they were no longer bleeding. The doubts still visited, but they no longer decided. And the loneliness that had once threatened to consume me had turned into something else, solitude. A gentle, nourishing kind of quiet, one I had grown to crave. I never heard from her again. And that, too, was a kind of gift. There are conversations that don't need to be had, apologies that would only unearth old pain. We had both played our parts. We had both made our choices, and in the end, life had spoken more clearly than either of us could. The final word wasn't mine. It was time's. I imagined her sometimes, not out of longing but curiosity. I wondered if she ever sat alone in her office, staring out at the skyline, remembering the man she once left behind. I wondered if she ever traced back the moments and asked herself what would have happened if she'd waited. If she'd believed in me just a little longer. But those were thoughts for novels, not real life. In reality, we move forward. Not because the past heals itself, but because we learn how to carry it differently. My days now are quiet, purposeful. I mentor young founders, help them see around corners. I teach them that building something real takes more than intelligence. It takes character, integrity, patience, and most of all, self-awareness. You can't disrupt the world if you're still at war with yourself. I don't need accolades. I don't need features in glossy magazines or recognition from crowds who worship noise. I've learned the kind of man I want to be doesn't need to be known by many, just known deeply by a few, and fully by himself. And I've become that man. Slowly, deliberately, gracefully. Every now and then, someone will mention Eli's in passing, some article, some panel, some award. They say her company rebounded. They say she adapted, pivoted, reinvented. I hope that's true. I hope she's well. I hope she found the thing she was chasing all those years. Not the title, not the status, but the feeling of finally being enough. Because I found it. Not in a boardroom. Not in a bank statement. But in a morning with no urgency. In a life where I no longer need to be seen to know I exist. Where I no longer need to be chosen to know I'm worthy. And that, more than anything, is the lesson. Not how to win, but how to become the kind of person who doesn't need to.